מצוות אשא ובשם השם אקרא.
Shavua Tov, a good week, a good vach in Yiddish. We're off to a new week. May it be a sweet one, because this week is going to end in Rosh Hashanah. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness with a new candle. Who is with us on this lovely Saturday night? Melissa Itel Jurin says good evening from Great Neck, New York. Wakas Qureshi says good. James Roth from Indianapolis. Bo Forrester from Gun Barrel City, Texas. Boom, boom. Joy Lynn says Shema from New Jersey in the Pines. I guess Shalom. Brian Hoffman Walden from Forest Grove, Oregon. Sheila Lesser from Spring, Texas. Danielle Vizana from Peabody, Mass. Sarah McKay says Shalom from Apple Valley in the emergency room. I needed your wisdom today. Oy vey, may you have a refuah shlema, a complete healing. Bo Forrester says Shalom Riders from GBC, Texas. GBC, it's not coming to me. Charles Shapiro from Omaha, Nebraska. Victoria B. Beaudry Aspen Leiter from Lancaster, California. Know it well. Joy Lynn loves the music that was Keep Alive, performing Havdalah. That's the Havdalah ceremony that we sing when we ease out of Shabbos and into the new week. Sharon Fran Brooks says Shavua Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Rachel Vox says good vach from Baltimore. And Nancy Jones is with us from St. Louis, Missouri. And Brenda Alicia Troon from Brighton, Colorado. And Lacey K says East Texas is here. All right. Where are we holding? This is Daf Lamed Daled. That's page 34 in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 3. Which is all about the Eruv itself. Usually when we use the word Eruv, we mean the enclosure. We're going to make an Eruv so that we can join courtyard, so that we can carry throughout a courtyard if there are multiple homes in the courtyard, or we're going to join courtyards together so we can carry throughout all those courtyards, sort of like a subdevelopment joined by an alleyway, or a community Eruv so that we can carry on Shabbos throughout that whole neighborhood, even a large part of a city, or an Eruv Techumen, where we're going to join boundaries, or we're going to move our Shabbos dwelling in that direction so we can go further in that direction on Shabbos and subtract the amount of distance we could travel in that direction, because there's a limit of how far we can walk on Shabbos. As we're going to see in this chapter, we've been talking about the basket of food, that for all these different kinds of Eruv, we have to deposit a basket of food somewhere, and that establishes our Shabbos dwelling, where that basket of food is. And the Gemara, the rabbis of the Talmud, will discuss the basket of food and call it the Eruv. Where are we placing our Eruv? Where are we placing our Shabbos dwelling? So the word Eruv is going to have a little bit of multiple meanings. But we're discussing in this chapter the food that's in that basket, what kind of food, how much food, where is that basket located, what's the status of the food in it, and the accessibility of that basket. If we lose access to it on Shabbos, there's going to be some problems and the whole Eruv may not be valid. So that's the general topic we've been discussing. Okay, so we're going to have a few different cases here on page 34 of Tractate Shabbos. First case, if the Eruv, the basket of food, is in a pit, right? So he placed the basket of food in a pit. It's deeper than 10 handbreadths. So that pit becomes its own private domain. If he intended to make his Shabbos dwelling in the pit and the food is there, great. He and his basket or his dwelling and that food are in the same place. It's a valid Eruv. But if the food ended up in the pit and the person intended to establish his Shabbos dwelling up above on the ground outside the pit, so then it's a problem, right? He and his Eruv are in different places, And if that area above the pit is the public domain or a karmelit, or a karmelis in Ashkenaz pronunciation, we have a problem because he doesn't have access to the food. If he wanted to bring the food that's in that basket, that's in the pit, out to where he is, where he intended to establish his Shabbos dwelling, he would have to carry food on Shabbos from a private domain to a public domain, which is prohibited on a biblical level, or from the pit, which is a private domain, to a karmelis, which is neither a private domain nor a public domain, and it is prohibited to carry from the private domain to the karmelis by rabbinic law. Either way, he's prohibited to carry from one place to another. Therefore, he and his Eruv are in a different spot, and he doesn't have access to the food in that basket. And so what he intended to establish, to move that Shabbos dwelling, whether it was an enclosure or a joining of courtyards or an Erev Techumen to change his dwelling so he could walk further in one direction, not a valid Eruv. But so now we just made this distinction that if the land at the top of the pit, right, the pit is in the ground somewhere, and the ground up above where he intended to establish his dwelling, if it was a public domain, this is just not going to work. But if it was a karmelis, and so an example of a karmelis is a field, right, out in the field, a field on a big farm field that is not a private domain or a public domain. It's not a private domain, okay, it's not owned, it's not going to work as a private domain because it's not a residential area. And it's not a public domain because it lacks some of the features of a public domain, like that a lot of people walk through there. So it's prohibited only on a rabbinic level. According to Rebbi, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as we've seen yesterday and the day before, at twilight, which is the time of doubt between day on Friday and night on Friday night. So during that twilight period, there's a doubt whether Shabbos has begun or not. So it's a case of doubt. And in cases of doubt, with regards to the rabbinic prohibitions of Shabbos, Rebbi rules that we are lenient, right? And so he could pull it out at twilight on Shabbos. The rabbis who dispute Rebbi's ruling would say, no, you can't. In this case of doubt, the rabbinic prohibition of things that you can't do on Shabbos, at twilight, you still can't do them. Rebbi says you can do them. So according to Rebbi, he would have access to his basket of food down in that pit below the level of the karmelis. He would have access at twilight, and therefore, it doesn't even matter if he moves the food or not, since he has the possibility of moving that food during what is probably Shabbos, what is maybe Shabbos. That's good enough. According to Rebbi, it's a valid Eruv, and now his Eruv is good for the rest of Shabbos. That ends our discussion of Mishnah number 4 in chapter 3. If you have tonight's class, I think, is going to be relatively quick. So if you have questions, put them in the comments, and we'll get to it toward the end. Okay. Now, Mishnah number 5 of chapter 3. This is the case of an Eruv, the basket of food, placed on top of a reed. Okay, so what does this word reed mean? It's an English translation. But we're basically talking about, you could almost think of it as bamboo. It's not bamboo, it's some other kind of a reed, but and there are different types of reeds. There are different subspecies or species of reeds. Some are very stiff, like a big, thick bamboo pole. Some are much thinner, and really like marsh grasses, right? So we're talking here about a reed that has enough strength that you could put your basket of food on top of it. Why would anybody put his basket of food on top of a reed in the public domain? Maybe he would have some reason to do that because it's a safe place. No one's going to take his basket of food away from that pole. If he can get it up there, it's going to stay there during Shabbos. So maybe there's a real world application, or maybe this is just a hypothetical case that the rabbis posit for us to try and understand, well, what is the law in this situation? Either way, if he placed his basket of food, his Eruv, on top of a pole, even if it's 100 amos high, 100 cubits high, very tall indeed, like 150 feet high, this is going to be a valid Eruv. Why? Why? Because he's intending to establish his dwelling, right? This pole is very thin. So whether he intended to establish his dwelling at the top of the pole or at the base of the pole, either way, you get what, for establishing your Shabbos dwelling in a public domain, you get a kind of legal 4 cubits at the base. And and that's a private domain which extends infinitely up or down. So the basket is going to be in his private domain, and therefore he and his Eruv are in the same place, and it's a valid Eruv. It seems like this is according. So let me just get this right. Oh yeah, the Mishna, so that's the basic idea, but the Mishna continues and it says, so if it's on top of this pole, even 100 feet high, it's a valid Eruv, but only if the reed was cut and then reinserted into the ground. If it's a growing reed, right? If it's a reed that is just there, that has grown out of the ground, and he places it on top, it's no good. It's not valid. But if he cuts the reed and then reinserts it into the ground so that it stands there like a flagpole, then putting the basket on top is a valid Eruv. So why does the reed need to be cut, need to be detached from the ground in order to make this valid Eruv where we put the basket on top of the reed? It seems like this Mishnah is according to the rabbis who don't permit use of a tree, which is a rabbinic prohibition, as we've seen a few times. You can't make use of a tree on Shabbos. It's just one of those rabbinic prohibitions to say that, if you use a tree to do something, you're going to be performing some kind of labor that involves making use of the tree, and it's prohibited. But it's a rabbinic prohibition. So according to Rebbi, so he would have access at twilight, as we just discussed a moment ago, but the rabbis don't permit that. So it seems like leaning it against a reed that is still attached to the ground is like making use of a tree. The rabbis would prohibit that. Rebbi would permit that. So it seems like this Mishnah is according to the rabbis who dispute Rebbi. However, the Gemara says, actually, this Mishnah could be even according to Rebbi. Why? Because it's not that we're concerned we're making use of a tree, that this reed is actually going to be considered a tree and we can't make use of it on Shabbos, but rather that if we put a basket on top of this reed that's growing in the ground, if we were to go and try to fetch the basket off it, I don't know, either by climbing the pole, climbing the reed, or just bending it to pull it down to get the basket off it, what might happen is that we break the reed on Shabbos. In other words, we cut the reed by mistake on Shabbos. And that would be violating a biblical prohibition, a Torah prohibition. You can't cut anything that's growing from the ground on Shabbos because that's like harvesting, that's like reaping. That is one of the 39 prohibited labors of Shabbos. Okay. There was an incident, and we're going to learn a little bit more about this rule and this idea of reeds and whether we're worried about cutting them on Shabbos or not, and whether they're considered trees or not. So there was an incident when the army came and took over the study hall in Neharde'a. Right? So Neharde'a, that's in Bavel. In Babylonia. So the army that we're talking about is not the Israeli army. Right? It's a Jewish community in a non-Jewish country. And so the army of that country comes along and says, yeah, we need your building to house our soldiers while we're going to be in this town, because whatever they're doing there. So who was it? It was Rav Nachman, I believe. Yeah, so Rav Nachman told his students, okay, so we don't have the use of our study hall on Shabbos. We are, of course, going to be, we're going to be praying and learning Torah on Shabbos. We need a place to do that. So go out in that marsh over there and trample the reeds so that we'll have a soft, dry place to sit on Shabbos. So immediately, one of the people that was there, Rami Bar Chama, objected. and citing our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah says that you can't make use of reeds on Shabbos unless they've been detached before Shabbos, lest you come to detach them on Shabbos. So, trampling these reeds is not going to cut it. Literally, it's not cutting it. What we need to do is cut them, not just step on them so that they sort of bend over and there's a place to sit there. Rav Nachman answered him, well, actually, reeds, it's not just one type of plant, it's a category of plants. And within the world of reeds, there are hard reeds that can break, and then we're concerned. And those are like trees. And so the kind of hard reeds that grow stiff, that could break, those are considered trees. And we have the example of the law of kilayim, which is that we can't plant diverse kinds together. And specifically, we can't plant herbs, like any kind of vegetables, let's say, or herbs, in a vineyard where we're growing grapes, either to eat grapes or to make wine. So we can't plant herbs or vegetables in a place where we're growing grapes. That's just one of those prohibited laws from the Torah. Are reeds, but you can have trees in a vineyard, right? Trees can be in a vineyard. We don't have to worry about violating the law against diverse kinds, but not herbs. So some reeds are permitted in a vineyard, and some reeds, we have two teachings. One says reeds are permitted to be planted in a vineyard, and there's another teaching that reeds are not permitted to be planted in a vineyard. And so Rav Nachman explains, how is it possible that reeds are both permitted and not permitted to be planted in a vineyard? It's because there are different kinds of reeds. The stiff, hard ones are like trees, and those are permitted in a vineyard. And the soft ones that bend easily are considered like herbs, and those are not permitted to be planted in a vineyard alongside the grapes. So likewise, with the example of the marsh, here we're talking about the soft kind. So the soft kind, with regards to the laws of Shabbos and making an Eruv, don't violate the Mishnah that we're talking about here, the fifth Mishnah, because we don't have to worry that if we, come to use them or bend them on Shabbos that they'll break, because they're soft. They don't break. They're like herbs. And on Shabbos, we can walk on grass. We don't have to worry that we're going to detach grass from the ground by walking on it, whereas other things we would have to worry that we would be detaching it. And so the reeds that are in this marsh that Rav Nachman was telling his students, go trample them, we don't have to worry that they violate this Mishnah. They don't. They're not like trees. They're not going to break. Trampling them is going to be enough so that we'll just have a comfortable place to sit on Shabbos. We don't have to detach them all from the ground, as Rami Bar Chama suggested. Okay, and that finishes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now we're going to open our discussion of Mishnah number 6, the case of the lost key. So, if the Eruv, this basket of food, is placed in a cupboard, and the cupboard is locked, and the key is lost, so now what do we think is going to happen? Well, we've just said that if a person and his Eruv are like a person's Shabbos dwelling and his Eruv are separated, and he doesn't have access to his Eruv, so then we would say that the enclosure, the Eruv in terms of carrying or walking, is not going to be valid because he can't get to the food in that basket. Nevertheless, at the 6th Mishnah here of chapter 3 says that the Eruv is valid. If you put the food in a cupboard and you lock the cupboard and then you lost the key, the Eruv is valid nevertheless. Rabbi Eliezer has a minority opinion here in the Mishnah, and he says if he doesn't know that the key is in its place, it's no good. So it's interesting. It doesn't say that it's like he doesn't have to know necessarily where the key, he doesn't have to have the key, right? According to Rabbi Eliezer, he just has to know that the key is in its place, right? He knows that the key is somewhere specific. That's enough. and then it's a valid Eruv. But if he doesn't know where the key is, and he doesn't even know that it's in its place, then it's no good, according to Rabbi Eliezer. But that's the minority opinion. The majority, the anonymous majority of the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Eliezer, have said that even if he loses the key, it's a valid Eruv. So the Gemara immediately objects and says, but wait a minute, he and his Eruv, his dwelling and his Eruv, are in different places. He doesn't have access. This should not be a good Eruv. So Rav and Shmuel usually argue with each other, but Rav and Shmuel both cite a Mishnah which says that if there was both of them say that this cupboard, with what cupboard are we dealing with here? Say Rav and Shmuel, we're talking about a cupboard that is made of bricks. Why bricks? Because we have another Mishnah which talked about a house in which there was food locked in the house and people couldn't get to it. And they said that, but then there was a breach in the wall of the house. And so then the question was, let's say it was an accidental hole in the wall of the house, but it formed. So they didn't have access to it at the beginning of Shabbos. The question is, during Shabbos, could they now, since this hole opened up, can they go in and take the food and eat it on Shabbos? And the answer is yes. And not only that, but Rabbi Meir says you could even make a hole in the brick wall of the house to get at that food and eat it on Shabbos. So Rav and Shmuel now say, well, we can follow Rabbi Meir's teaching, and this cupboard that where we had the Eruv inside of it, the basket of food inside of it, and we locked it and lost the key, according to Rabbi Meir, we could even make a hole, because it's a brick cupboard. So if it's a brick cupboard, so that we can make a hole and we can get at our Eruv, and that's why the Mishnah says that it's a valid Eruv, even though we lost the key and we can't get at it. Why? Because we could just bust a hole in the back of the cupboard and get to it. However, they're limiting this application to a cupboard that's made out of bricks. According to this teaching, if it was made out of wood, the normal substance for a cupboard, we would not be allowed to do this. What would be the problem? Busting this hole would seem to violate the prohibition of demolition on Shabbos. In fact, the Gemara will say, now hold on a second, Rav Nachman Bar Ada said that when Shmuel said this teaching that we must be talking about a cupboard made out of bricks, this is only going to refer to, and so was that Mishnah what Rabbi Meir was talking about, it was only referring to a structure where it was made of loose bricks. It was like some kids made a fort out of bricks that happened to be lying around. Yeah, that you could open up. But if it was literally a brick wall where there was mortar keeping the bricks in that wall, no, you can't bust through that wall on Shabbos to get in the house of the food, and no, you can't bust into this brick cupboard in order to get at the basket of food inside, and therefore, according to this, it should not be a valid Eruv because we don't have access to it in this cupboard because we lost the key. Okay. Rabbi Zera says, actually, the rule that was said about breaking the wall was talking about a festival, Yom Tov, not Shabbos. So we learned before that a festival, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, it has all the same rules and restrictions on work as Shabbos, except that we can do things that are required to prepare food. We can cook on Yom Tov. We can cook on a festival. We can't cook on Shabbos. And since we can cook on a festival, we can do other kinds of work that are related to food preparation, and those are going to be okay too. So Rabbi Zera says the rule about breaking that wall happened on a festival with regard to breaking into that locked house to get at the food. So the Gemara says, okay, so it says, fine. So in our Mishnah, we must also be talking about a festival, right? So we're talking about an Eruv that was made for a festival, not for Shabbos. And in that case, the fact that we lost the key doesn't matter because we have the possibility of breaking into the cupboard as long as it was made out of loose bricks and not cemented bricks, lest we get involved in actual demolition. But then the Gemara says, well, no, that doesn't make sense, because if you're saying that our Mishnah about creating an Eruv is talking about a festival and not about Shabbos, which is where our logic has brought us so far, then we have an additional problem, because that Mishnah had a Tosefta which followed it, which says that Rabbi Eliezer, in addition to saying if he doesn't know that the key is in its place, even if he doesn't know where that place is, Rabbi Eliezer said if he doesn't know that the key is in its place, the Eruv is no good. Rabbi Eliezer also says that if the key was lost in the city, it's a valid Eruv, but if it was lost in the countryside, then it is not a valid Eruv. Why? Because if the key was lost in the city, then if the key were found, we would be able to bring the key to the cupboard, right? We could bring it to the cupboard. How? Because we're in a city. We can carry, because there's going to be the Eruv of courtyards, or we could bring it over rooftops. In a city, there's going to be a way to carry within that city, especially these small cities of the Talmudic period that are Jewish communities. They usually have some kind of Eruv established, perhaps only courtyards and alleyways, but when you combine that with going across rooftops, we're going to be able to get the key to the cupboard. But if the key was lost in the countryside, then that would require carrying a key through a karmelis, possibly through a private domain. In order to get the key to the cupboard, we'd have to violate Shabbos, at least on a rabbinic level, and perhaps even on a biblical level. But, says the Gemara, what are you talking about? If we're saying that this Mishnah has to do with a festival Eruv and not with a Shabbos Eruv, why are we worried about carrying? We can carry on a festival. I had to be reminded of that. I'm not sure that we discussed that in Tractate Shabbos. But you can carry on a festival even though you can't carry on Shabbos. That's another one of those distinctions. Why? Presumably because carrying is something that is related to food preparation, right? So you need to carry the groceries, I guess, that you're going to put into the food prep. And I guess that's why we talk about, we actually recite a declaration that we make before a festival so that we can cook on the festival, and that also has to do with carrying on the festival. So why would Rabbi Eliezer say this if he wasn't talking about a Shabbos Eruv? He knows that we can carry on a festival. If he's saying that the problem with if the key was lost in the country, then it's no good Eruv, it's because we can't carry the key to the cupboard, then that obviously shows that he's talking about a Shabbos Eruv, not a festival Eruv. And we are back to the original question. Why is it that the rabbis ruled that this Shabbos Eruv, where the basket of food was placed in a cupboard and the key was lost, is still a valid Eruv? We don't have an answer yet. To get that answer, tune in tomorrow, Sunday. It's going to be our regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. All right, let's check if you have comments or questions. Let's see. Lynn in Texas. When it is mentioned that a closet is carried, does this mean rather like a chest or a steamer trunk type item? Right, so that's one of the laws discussed in this page that I didn't discuss on our show tonight, because I find it confusing also. I'd have to go back and understand it better, but basically the idea was that the rabbis were saying that if he actually meant to make his dwelling on top of a closet and the basket was down on the ground, then he and his Eruv would be in a different place, and it would be difficult to get himself or to get the Eruv up to where he is without violating Shabbos if the difference was more than 10 handbreadths or less than 10 handbreadths. It was a little bit confusing. And they also talked about a very tall closet. So I'm not sure, Lynn. That's my answer. I'm not sure. Another question is, I noticed the pit and it made me think of caves. Besides the Eruv food, does a cave need any kind of added Eruv marker? Well, what do you mean? Are you saying like if the cave is within the public domain, but the cave itself is going to be its own private domain, can he establish his Eruv in the cave? Yeah, why not? Because a cave is a dwelling, right? A cave is a type of dwelling, so he can definitely put it there. Does it need some other kind of marker? I mean, are you talking about an enclosure? I mean, you can carry within the cave because the cave is a private domain. It's a type of private domain. Because it has an entrance and it has partitions around it, right? It's enclosed. And if it goes down, it also has the height difference, but I don't even think you need that. It could be a cave in a hillside and it would still work. Bill Aldridge, this is the point where I get really pedantic and ask, how hard does a reed have to be a tree and not an herb? Good question. Really good. It seems like it needs to be soft enough that if you stepped on it, you would not be concerned that it would break. At least based on what we learned on our daf today. That seems to be the definition, right? Because if you're concerned, like we're not concerned that grass is going to become detached from the ground. Or diamondia, right, which is a grass substitute, but that is actually a succulent. It seems like we can walk on that and not worry that it's Shabbos. But if it's, like I guess we'd be very careful. We wouldn't want to walk through a cornfield because, like moving that stuff aside. I'm totally making that up. I don't know. But in terms of reeds, it seems like soft enough that you could walk on it and not worry that it would be detached. And finally, Sharon Frantbrook. So one can carry a shofar on Rosh Hashanah or a lulav on Sukkot. Yeah, you can. But not if it's Shabbos, right? And that's why, I got to make sure of this, but I think we're not going to be blowing the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Is that right? I'm not sure. Now I'm not sure about that because maybe we could have just left it at synagogue. But I ought to know that, and I just didn't look it up. And I've experienced this, but it's been a few years, and now I'm not sure. But I think we don't, right? Could somebody put that in the comments for me? I ought to have this on the tip of my tongue, and I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure we don't blow the shofar when Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos. But luckily, it's a 2-day holiday, and maybe that's why it's a 2-day holiday, whether you're in Israel or not, right? So other, like Passover is a 1-day holiday, in Israel, and it's a 2-day holiday outside of Israel, and that was about the uncertainty of the calendar, right? So all these other ones that are based on uncertainty, because when the new moon was declared in Jerusalem, they couldn't be sure that the news would get that the new month had started to the outlying provinces, as it were. Right, but we don't blow the shofar on Shabbos, and we'd hate to have a Rosh Hashanah without a shofar. And so I'm not sure if that's entirely the logic, but it may well be that that's the reason that we have 2-day Rosh Hashanah, so that we will definitely hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, even if the first day is Shabbos, like it's going to be this coming Friday night. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. Tune in tomorrow to find out why it's a valid Eruv if we locked it in a cupboard and lost the key, and the rabbis say it's still a valid Eruv. Have a great evening. Look forward to see you tomorrow with God's help. All the best.